the narrative has been used by the Israeli government to justify, I would argue, the genocide of the Palestinian people, and it would be a lot harder for those who support Israel's subsequent actions to justify that support, and it would have been a lot harder for Israel on the international stage to garner the support that it has garnered from, European and US administrations.
I want to thank leaders across the world who are standing with Israel today. I want to thank the people and Congress of the United States of America. In fighting Hamas, Israel is not only fighting for its own people, it is fighting for every country that stands against barbarism.
So that wouldn't have happened had we confronted from the outset all the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming in my view, all the evidence which suggests this was an Israeli let it happen on purpose false flag.
Välkomna till Folkets Radio. Welcome to the People's Radio. Today with British investigative journalist Iain Davis. Welcome.
Thanks, pal. I hope I got that right. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about your recent investigations, 3 articles analyzing the October 7th attacks on Israel. You claim that the evidence indicates that these attacks were in fact false flag attacks, that elements within the Israeli government directly or indirectly orchestrated or at least knew that the attack was coming and allowed it to happen. So before we dive into all of this, perhaps you can say a few words about yourself and also how you came to investigate this topic.
My name's Iain Davis. I'm a writer and journalist from the UK. I've been doing this now probably for a little more than about 10 years, I think. And my initial kind of understanding and appreciation of false flag terror as a subject came probably from looking at things like Operation Gladio, which existed across Europe. It involved Sweden as well. It extended to terror activity that was going on in Sweden, and it's a proven fact that Gladio existed. It was run by the intelligence agencies, and it went on from about the late 50s to the late 80s, early 90s. Was exposed in the European courts. There's a European parliamentary resolution on the Gladio affair, and the kind of official story is that it was a NATO-run, decades-long false flag terror campaign that waged across Europe. And they were typically using far-right terrorist groups like Ordine Nuevo to commit acts of terrorism, which the media would then subsequently blame on far-left groups like the Red Brigade, in order to do things like manipulate elections, overturn elections in some cases. In Italy, that happened. Basically to propagandize the people into what was using something that was called the strategy of tension, which a well-known Gladio operative called Vinci Guerra spoke about the strategy of tension, and the objective was to terrify the population and force them to run for the security of the state, thus enabling the state to pass fairly draconian legislation that otherwise the public wouldn't accept. So that was the purpose of this particular false flag terror campaign. So, personally, I'm of the view that if we look at events like 9/11, that was evidently another false flag terror event. I would strongly argue that the Islamist extremists that were blamed for 7/7 in the UK, which took place in 2005, was another example certainly of a manipulated terror event. So I think, it's safe to say that it is a commonly used tactic. And, there are many other examples that we can look at around the world of exactly this. That is not to say that terrorism doesn't exist, which is often the allegation that is thrown at you if you talk about the potential for it to be false flag terror. That's not, nobody that ever talks about these subjects has ever made that claim. Of course, there are real terror groups around the world that have and continue to commit acts of terror, real terror. But the extent to which the intelligence agencies are involved, aware of, or involved in these groups also means that we need to be, I would say, skeptical about any narrative that we are given about any one particular terror event. And I think all of us should reserve the right to look at that evidence that is presented, apply some critical thinking, and examine that evidence to make up our own minds about what we believe may be the cause of that event.
I would like to just quote, read a short passage, a quote from the beginning of your first article. The Hamas attack was a despicable act of horrific violence. Nothing justifies it, and I do not defend, sympathize, nor identify with Hamas or its Islamist extremist partners. I do point to the evidence indicating that Hamas would not exist were it not for the consistent, long-standing support it has received over the years from Israeli government and its partners. End of quote. So perhaps this is a good place to begin with some background. Some people watching this have very little prior knowledge. What exactly is Hamas, and what role has Israel been playing in creating and funding and supporting this organization?
Well, yeah, originally Hamas was formed as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, people who are aware of the extensive backing of the Muslim Brotherhood certainly by Western intelligence agencies and Western governments would be aware immediately that the likelihood of government involvement in the creation of Hamas, not just the Israeli government, Western government involvement in the creation of Hamas is increased by the fact that it's a branch or it stems from the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, that doesn't mean that it is, but certainly it would give rise to that suspicion. If we then look at how the Hamas began, and I forget the name of Sheikh who ran the names. Names often elude me. I write about them, but then they escape me. Who started the what was essentially an Islamist educational kind of support and providing services to people that were in the then occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. That when events occurred like the first Intifada, I think it's pretty clear that the Hamas leadership, which had been sat on the fence somewhat prior to which the first Intifada was the uprising of the Palestinian people against the occupation of the Israelis. I think I'm going to get the year wrong, but they were sat on the fence up to that point, and then they threw their weight behind a popular uprising. So certainly Hamas at that point were encapsulated the popular sentiment of the people, of the Palestinian people. So they were representative of that. But in terms of how they were funded, how they were equipped, it is quite clear that Israel, working very closely with Qatar, was funneling funds to the nascent formation of Hamas. So the reason why the Israeli government was interested in doing this is because Hamas was opposed to the Palestinian Authority. So Hamas was divisive to that extent. So today we've got senior politicians and influential politicians on the far right of the Israeli establishment, people like Smotrich, who have openly said that Hamas is good good for us. Hamas is I think he said a valuable asset. So this doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm not implying, I'm not implying by this, that people that are involved in the struggle, which Hamas is the leader of, are all, some sort of Israeli intelligence assets. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. What I am suggesting is that if we look at the evidence, the creation of Hamas and the reason why Israel might have been interested in promoting Hamas and is pretty clear. And that there is certainly, if we look at the funding, there's obvious occasions when Israel has been funding the support Hamas.
So I guess the usual Israeli response is that yes, Hamas was created in order to divide and conquer, and it turned out to be a mistake. It resulted in the creation of this Frankenstein's monster. But do you think this is a sufficient explanation, or do you think that at some level there is more to it?
I think what is overlooked in that is firstly saying that it was a mistake that it became this Frankenstein. It wouldn't have become the alleged or purported Frankenstein were it not for the consistent support that it has received, certainly in terms of funding, from elements within the Israeli state. It couldn't have survived. And another thing that that has happened over Hamas's history is that when it is in trouble politically, domestically, when people have turned against it, as they did in sort of the early 2000s, due to Hamas's inability. I mean, let's face it, Hamas as the elected government of Gaza, which is a good point. I mean, it was initially elected as the government of Gaza. The elections have subsequently been stopped. People would say, well, that's because Hamas is fearful of being booted out, but that isn't really the case. It's that obviously running elections in the situation that the people of Gaza are currently in is not feasible. It's not something that could be done. But nonetheless, Hamas at times when it's been in trouble has had support in terms of things that the Israelis have done to bolster Hamas's public image. Things like interventions where when they bombs, assaults, air assaults on Gaza at an opportune moment for Hamas to claim indignation and rally public support for itself. Now, is that bad planning? Is that just an oversight on the Israeli government's part, or are they deliberate actions in order to maintain a useful group from the Israeli government's perspective?
So before we address the attack itself on October 7, were there any circumstances during the period before the attack that raised questions?
Well, certainly the government of Netanyahu was under a lot of pressure. So it was widely touted as by the Israeli press. It's raining very heavily, so I hope you can still hear me.
Oh, sure.
By the Israeli press as the most far right government in Israeli history. He had to form a coalition, Netanyahu, with what we might call ultra-nationalist Zionists, people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are leaders of, in Ben Gvir's case, of a Kalanist movement. They believe in the ethos of Kahani, which is the total extermination of, well, not just Palestinians, Muslims. So these people were influential, and he had Netanyahu, who was also under numerous indictments for potential fraud and so forth, had to form a coalition government And it's arguable that the ultra-Zionist right held the balance of power, and that he wouldn't have been able to form that government without them. So yeah, there was an impetus for some sort of unifying event that would detract from Netanyahu's domestic policy difficulties and personal situation and legal difficulties, and unite the nation behind his government, which, as I said, is very much the balance of power, I would suggest at the time, was very much held by those far right ultra nationalist Zionists.
But you point out also that several battalions of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, were moved from Gaza to the West Bank shortly prior to the attack.
Yeah, so if you look at what happened prior to the attack, there were lots of people, including some of the observation units that were on what was called the Iron Wall, which was actually a fence, but we'll call the Iron Wall, who were warning of significant Hamas build-up and activity in the immediate proximity to the border, mass training exercises. Now, in addition to that, the Israeli intelligence had named a document that they'd got hold of called Jericho Wall, which the story goes that they got this from a Hamas source, which laid out in quite precise detail the attack that subsequently unfolded on October the 7th. Now, they'd had this for more than a year, this document, which they call Jericho Wall, and they'd obviously spread that information quite widely among their observers, people like the Near Oz observation post, which is one of the kind of main posts on the border. And they'd obviously spread that because when the observers were reporting this mass mobilization of Hamas to their senior commanders, they were quite clearly referencing that plan. They were saying, well, this looks like Jericho Wall. This looks like they're preparing for it. And I have to stress as well that it wasn't just military observers and IDF personnel or Shin Bet operatives who were reporting this. It was also being reported by members of the public that lived on the Gaza border. There was a group of radio enthusiasts who monitored communications in Gaza that were openly discussing this on their WhatsApp group. This is, and I would again this is all prior to the October the 7th event, and also there was, for example, a woman who was a local tour guide who went on national radio before the attack to say that she had raised concerns with the local IDF commanders about what was happening, i.e. that Hamas is mobilizing for some mass assault that looks like Jericho Wall, and was told not to worry about it. At the same time, for years, this has been going on for years, IDF defences on the border, as you said, were being moved away from the border. So on the one hand, we've got all this intelligence that is coming to the Israeli intelligence agencies, warning of this build-up, and the likelihood of an attack, which they've got a fairly clear indication what that attack will entail, because when Hamas did breach the so-called Iron Wall, when they did that and attacked, they followed almost exactly the plan that was laid out in Jericho Wall. So they actually had a very clear idea of what Hamas was planning. In addition to this, Hamas does an annual propaganda video called Strong Pillar. It puts out this Strong Pillar video annually where it shows its military prowess and what it is capable of. And obviously it is intended as propaganda, but nonetheless, the Strong Pillar video they put out only about a month before, I think in September, of 2023 showed them ostensibly carrying out what was called Jericho Wall. So they put a video out. I mean, this is as insane as it sounds. They put a video out, and that was showing themselves doing a plan that the Israelis already had a clear indication of what they would do, amid warnings that were coming from numerous IDF observers and Shin Bet operatives and members of the public that they were building up their forces and preparing for an attack. And at the same time, instead of, you would think, at least observing some sort of precautionary principle and leaving, some sort of viable defenses there, progressively the Israeli government moved defenses away from the Gaza border, relocating them. Initially, they said they would relocate it in the West Bank. Subsequently, they've said that actually, no, we relocated them on the Lebanese border. But wherever they relocated them, they moved them away from Southern Command, which is the command which is overseeing the defenses of the Gazan border. So, if that was all an accident and all, mistakes were made, which is the official narrative, all of those mistakes, all of them, consistently enabled Hamas to carry out their attack with facing little or no resistance at the time.
I have heard theories put forward even by harsh Israeli critics like Norman Finkelstein that they get so many warnings all the time, so they didn't really manage to sort out which warnings to take seriously and so on. But I guess you don't accept that.
Well, other than all of the things that I've just said, one of the arguments that has been made is that that Israel was overly reliant upon what we might call digital surveillance, that it was overly reliant on AI analysis, that it wasn't taking heed of human intelligence, that the warnings that were coming from their own observation posts. Now, for a start, this digital signal intelligence, SIGINT, has to be interpreted by human beings who write reports and send them to their commanders. Now, if you have got multiple observers on the wall, for example, the observers from the Neros observation post, repeatedly warning that they can see Hamas training and preparing for a mass assault. You've got members of the public warning of the same thing. You've got senior commanders from places like the Ream military base writing official reports to the head of the intelligence agencies saying that they anticipate a mass assault. I don't think saying, oh, we didn't notice is viable by any stretch of the imagination. If it is, then what's the purpose of having all this kind of observation posts? What is the point of an observation post if you ignore what they've reportedly observed? There's no point in having them, is there?
If it's possible, without drowning in details, to sort of outline the official story of the attack and then highlight the parts of the official story that you find the most implausible, and we can go deeper into some of them, but just like to get an overview.
Yeah, so on the morning of the 7th of October 2023, Hamas breached the so-called Iron Wall. And so I think this is an important distinction to make. What I'm talking about is the official account as it was originally reported. So this was the account up to about 3 or 4 months after the attack. That account has now changed. But this is what was originally reported by the media in Israel, by official sources in Israel, including the IDF. So this is the original account. So the original account is that Hamas breached it in 29 separate locations simultaneously, unopposed, largely unopposed. They then managed to take, I think, 6 or 7 observation posts. They took out all the observation communication towers along the wall. They did this by flying drones over them and dropping explosives on. They did all this simultaneously. And after making the initial 29 breakthroughs, they then widened those with trucks and diggers and things like that and JCBs, and made the holes bigger so that more people could run through, and estimated at the time 2,900 people. They also simultaneously had a maritime assault on bases, on the coastal bases, Israeli coastal bases north of Gaza. Once they'd broken through, they then moved up and down what was called Route 232, R232. They moved up and down that with abandon. They made it, their key target must have been the Ream military base, because the Ream military base is the center for Southern Command. So the Ream military base is, if they take that, then they've hobbled IDF defenses if they can take that base. So that was obviously a priority for them. They took that very, very quickly. So they started at, coming through in the early hours at sort of 06:30 in the morning, 7 a.m. in the morning. The reports are that they'd taken Ream by about 7:30. So it's difficult to envisage that they faced any resistance at Ream. How they can have taken it so quickly. We're told that Ream was initially assaulted by members of what Hamas would call their special forces, and that a small group of them, about 130 members of Hamas's special forces, took Ream. They also knocked out all of the observation posts. They took all of them as well, up and down the Gazan border. They then launched assaults on the kibbutzim and that were up and down, such as kibbutz Berry and places like that. They mass assaults on that, and they acted with impunity basically for 4 or 5 hours, up to 6 hours before the IDF mounted any kind of substantial defense. Obviously, during that period as well, they also reportedly stumbled across the festival, the Nova Festival, which was, this is important, which was about 2.5 kilometers north of the Ream military base. So they apparently stumbled across this by accident, and that was the single place where there was the largest loss of life. About 350 people were killed and taken hostage at the festival. So that's the official account. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, eventually turned up on the ground. They'd been flying sorties with helicopters since initially. That's the only response they had, was a helicopter response. And then the IDF turned up on the ground and repelled Hamas, who consequently, because they'd been free to act for many, many hours during the day, were able to retreat back behind the Gaza border with hostages. So that's the official account.
Yeah. You said that they stumbled upon this music festival. That is also sort of a tricky thing in the official narrative. What is problematic with that formulation?
Well, another part of the official narrative is that Hamas was surveilling and monitoring the military bases on the Israeli side of the border with drones, flying over what you would have thought would be highly secured airspace with no problem for many days leading up to the attack. Well, if they were flying drones over Ream military base, it is pretty difficult to think how they could have missed a massive rave going on just up the road from the base. You know, but apparently they did. This is the official account. They didn't know that the music festival was happening. The reason that the IDF gave for them not knowing that the festival was happening is that they didn't attack it by running across the open ground, or by advancing across the open ground from the border, but rather attacked it from the north by travelling south along Route 232. They said that they got to, the official account of the IDF is that they got to a junction. I think it's the Netivot junction. They got to that junction, were lost, went the wrong way. They were heading to Netivot, but were lost. This is according to the official account. Were lost and therefore headed in the wrong direction along 232, and subsequently stumbled across the festival, where they perpetrated what is one of the most amazing, utterly amazing acts of spontaneous military coordination that I would have thought any military has ever managed to achieve.
Mm-hmm.
Because they weren't, supposedly they're not expecting to find all these people who, you know, by all accounts, they were still the Hamas was supposedly still fighting festival security and police on the northern edge of the site at 08:30, but all other accounts say that people started fleeing the festival at 0700 when the rocket sirens went off. So by the time they got there, people had been running around and trying to flee that festival site for an hour, at least an hour. And yet they managed not only to take all the military objectives that they had, and not only to knock out all the communication and knock out all the defenses and take all the military bases, they also managed to round up hundreds of people that were running in all different directions that they were not, and kill all these people using small arms that they weren't expecting to find, who were hiding, who they didn't know where they were. So they did all that, and it's also important to bear in mind that the members of Hamas that were accused of the massacre at the Nova Festival, some of them came from the south, i.e. they came from the battle for what was called the battle for Ream, which, you know, there doesn't appear to have been any battle. They doesn't appear that they faced any resistance. So those Hamas fighters that were moving northwards up the 232 obviously weren't needed to secure the Ream military base that was lying behind them to the south. Well, they were moving up there at 7:30 in the morning. So at 7:30 in the morning, they'd seemingly secured their most crucial military target, and were then moving up south, moving up to, you know, potentially towards the kibbutzim that they attacked, not knowing that this festival, that they were about to stumble on this festival. So what they then did, you know, they changed their plan completely. They must have completely changed their plan. You know, instead of attacking static kibbutzim, they're now attacking a mobile, scattered group of people running around all over the place and driving up and down the road in their cars, reportedly, and managed to do that as well as achieve all their other stated objectives. So this is extraordinary, I would suggest.
The only thing I don't understand, I mean, this festival, I guess, also must have been announced on the internet, so you could read about it.
Mm-hmm.
What was the purpose then to, in the official narrative, claim that they just stumbled upon it?
Well, it's hard to know, isn't it? I mean, if you say they stumbled across it, then the questions that you ask there all become moot, don't they? Because yes, quite obviously it was something that was announced, I think, on the preceding Tuesday, that it would extend to the Saturday night. So on the Tuesday prior to the attack, the Nova Festival was due to end on the Friday, which would have meant that when Hamas launched its attack nobody would have been there. They would have all left. But because they extended it to the Saturday on the previous Tuesday, that meant that when Hamas attacked, there were loads of people there. So by saying it's they stumbled across it by accident, you're kind of disavowing yourself of any responsibility for planning. I mean, at the very basic point, why would you plan a festival on a highly contentious and volatile border? You know, it's not as if, although this was by far the biggest thing that Hamas had done for many, many, many years, it's not as if there hadn't been many attacks on the, and skirmishes in that area. So why would you plan a festival in a place like that?
And also, you mentioned that there were some testimonies that the Hamas warriors were sort of masquerading as IDF rescue forces and actually tricked some of the festival goers to believing that these were coming to the rescue, which also raises the question, if there was just they stumbled upon it, how did they have this masquerade prepared, so to speak?
Yeah, no, there are a couple of witness test accounts from the festival of people who look like the IDF beckoning people to come over to them. So obviously the festival goers would have thought they were running towards safety, and they were then gunned down by these people who looked like they were wearing IDF uniforms. So the initial reports of that, and there are other accounts as well of, for example, when they took the Ream military base, of people taking that base who looked like they were wearing IDF uniforms. So the official account is that for some reason, which is difficult to understand what that reason might have been, Hamas was wearing disguises. Now, bearing in mind that in order to take something like the Ream military base, you can't get through by pretending you're an IDF soldier. It has to be a frontal assault on a gate. That's how you're going to get into the base. You're not going to be able to get in there in sufficient numbers by pretending that you're an IDF soldier. But more importantly, as you quite rightly said, if, as the official count goes, they stumbled on Ream by accident, and if they took disguises with them, why were they dressing up and taking disguises to fool people, to lull people into a false sense of security at a festival, if they had no idea that festival was there? What gave them that idea? It doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. And I think a very interesting thing is that subsequent official reports, so the IDF, I can't, again, names, the IDF released a report in 2024 where the official account had changed. Instead of 2,900 people, there were 5,000. Instead of the people being killed by the Hannibal Directive, which they openly discussed in the immediate aftermath of the attack, that had been downplayed considerably. So there's no mention of Hamas taking IDF disguises. Now that is a war crime. It is a war crime to disguise yourself as an enemy combatant and use that to. Now the problem with the Israeli government, if we look at it, stand back a bit, the problem with the Israeli government alleging that war crime against Hamas is that they would have to admit that they're an enemy, a formal enemy combatant, rather than a proscribed terrorist group, which is what they call them. So they can't make that allegation, for example, at the UN, because they would have to concede that Hamas is an enemy combatant. So that's not likely. But nonetheless, in the propaganda war, you would have thought that it would be a big propaganda win for the Israeli intelligence agencies to make a big deal of the fact that there are all these witness accounts and film footage of people, supposedly Hamas, dressed up as the IDF. So you would think that would be something that they would make a big deal out of, but it's not in the official report, nor is it in the UN. It's not in the IDF's report, and it's not in the UN's report either. So, these footage, photograph and video footage of people that look like the IDF involved in that assault, and witness reports attesting to that, have just vanished from the official narrative. That's gone. That's been memory hold.
So one possibility, of course, being that they were actual IDF soldiers, not masquerading Hamas soldiers that were doing this killing.
Yeah, I mean, that is very speculative. We don't know. But certainly, if you consider that some of the first IDF units that were on the scene, officially on the scene, contained within them people who we can identify as extreme ultranationalists, Zionists, extreme ultra Zionists. So if we remember the official story of the 40 beheaded babies, that account was initially provided by a guy who was, and again names, by a guy who was a leading member of the West Bank Settlement Committee, a legal settlement committee, who had been reportedly involved in a mass assault by illegal settlers and the IDF on the town of Hawara, in where people were killed, houses were burned, shops were looted, and who had received support from people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and had openly called for the deaths of 7,000 Palestinians living in that town. Now, he was among the first. He was in something called Unit 171 or Unit 71 of the IDF. He was among one of the first people there in terms of IDF troops on the ground. So, that it raises the possibility, I suggest, that some of those IDF units might have been infiltrated by extreme ultra-Zionists who perhaps had another agenda. I mean, I think it would be foolish to overlook the possibility that, and in the obvious fact, in fact, that mass civilian casualties, greatly enhances the Israeli government's propaganda narrative. So the more civilian casualties you have, the greater your chances of using propaganda to convince the rest of the world that your subsequent actions are justified.
So then when it comes to the claim that the IDF, that the Israeli Defense Force, that they killed a lot of their own people, then this term comes in, the Hannibal Protocol, which maybe to some is confusing, because if I understand it correctly, it's sort of like a protocol, which means that they want to prevent at any cost Israeli soldiers to be captivated, to be captured by the enemy forces, even at the price of harming them. So is that also maybe can be used as a pretext for saying, well, that's the reason why maybe they gunned down some even Israelis in the turmoil, or maybe just sort of clarify a bit how this Hannibal directive Hannibal Protocol is part of the explanation that perhaps Israeli soldiers killed their own people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're quite right. The Hannibal Protocol or Hannibal Directive was supposedly abandoned in 2008, and it was just that if your own troops are in danger of being captured and taken hostage by, for example, Hamas, then you should kill them and kill everybody else. So you kill everyone. So you kill the obviously the objective is supposedly to kill the terrorists, quote unquote terrorists, but in so doing, you unavoidably have to kill your own troops as well. So that is the Hannibal Directive, which supposedly stopped in 2008. However, at the time, the initial IDF response was with helicopter gunships. They were the only assets that they had close enough in terms of mechanized military assets that they had close enough to respond at the time. Now, there were senior helicopter commanders who told the Israeli press at the time that as far as they were concerned, a mass Hannibal Directive was in force. There are reports of them not specifically targeting anyone in particular, but just mass killing. Just anybody that was moving up and down that road, anybody that was on the border, that was coming in across the border. I think the quote was that they had so they've got 30mm machine gun cannons mounted on these helicopters, and they emptied their bellies of thousands and thousands of rounds, firing at anything that moved for the course of the day. So, and they openly admitted, at the time that they weren't distinguishing between enemy combatants and their own people. Now, bearing in mind that when this activity was taking place, there were very few IDF defenses. So the other people that they were indiscriminately shooting at must have included civilians, because there were very few IDF. There wasn't an IDF response of any note. So then we have the IDF itself admitting that that the number of what they called friendly fire casualties, that is, when people are killed accidentally by their own side in a firefight, were immense. The IDF own spokesperson said that there were an immense number of these friendly fire incidents, and then further to that, the initial, we'll have to get into some gruesome details, but it is what it is. The initial body count following the the attack on the 7th was 1,400. Much of that was said to be due to the high number of bodies that had been burnt beyond identification. The IDF then reduced that to 1,200. So they immediately removed 14% of the initial casualty number, because they said that we mistakenly thought they were Hamas. That we mistakenly thought that they were Hamas fighters, but actually they were our own IDF or civilians as well. I would suggest. So that suggests, unless Hamas was burning its own fighters to I'll rephrase, I got that the wrong way. The IDF initially thought they were their own fighters, but then later said they turned out to be Hamas fighters, so they took them out of the casualty figures. So unless the Hamas was burning its own fighters to a crisp, that can only have been done by the IDF. Or, whether it was helicopter gunships or whether it was artillery. And that's another point as well. At Ream, there were witnesses talking about it being shelled with artillery. Well, Hamas doesn't have any artillery. It has quite a lot of rockets, and it has, rocket-propelled grenades. And I think the biggest, and again, this has all changed. This is going from contemporaneous reports at the time, official reports at the time. The IDF said that the biggest, heaviest weapon that Hamas had in its possession was the Shawaz anti-tank missile, which is a big a bazooka, a big shoulder launched bazooka. But people at Ream and people at the various kibbutz along the roads, mainly off the 232, and people who were at the festival kept talking about shelling, about being shelled. Now, some of the people that spoke about shelling were former IDF, because a lot of people, obviously, a lot of people in Israel, adults, have got military experience. So some of the people that were talking about shelling were former IDF troops, soldiers. So they know the difference between a shell and a rocket. But they kept talking about shelling. Well, Hamas can't have been shelling. They don't have that capacity, and they didn't have that capacity with them. Even if they fired rockets from inside Gaza, that isn't part of the official narrative, because all the rockets had been dispersed by about 8 o'clock in the morning. They fired 5,000 rockets in a very short period of time. So there's big problems with this. And then we get to testimony from survivors at places like Kibbutz Berry, who said that the IDF shelled their own kibbutz and killed everybody that was still alive in those kibbutzim. So when you add all this up together, I think the picture that it paints is that it's impossible to tell how many people were killed by Hamas and how many people were killed by Israelis, the IDF, essentially operating a mass Hannibal directive. Now, one of the things I've been criticized for is not saying that Hamas, had nothing to do with this, that they didn't kill civilians. Now, one of the reasons that people say that have accused me of that, I think, is because there is also footage that was shown across the world's media that has clearly been manipulated by AI. There's been some good analysis done that shows that some of the footage that has come from certainly Route 232 and from the Nova Music Festival was subsequently or contemporaneously manipulated using AI. But it is also true that Hamas itself, and this is not something that has come via the news wires. It's not something that has come from the Israeli side. Hamas itself put videos out which shows it engaged in, the mass killing of civilians, basically. So I am not, and as some people seem to suggest, because I've written these pieces, I am not suggesting that Hamas was either involved in the false flag, although you might suspect that they must have known something about it, or that they were not culpable for the deaths of civilians, because the evidence to me is very clear that they were responsible for killing unarmed civilians. So I give neither the Israelis nor Hamas any credit for what they did that day. And I stand by what I initially said, that it was a despicable act of violence on both sides.
Apart from what you have already mentioned here, was there anything else in the Israeli media response that you find sort of suspicious?
I mean, so for a start, so you've got this initial media response saying that there's this immense nut, and this went, and this didn't go on for a couple of weeks after the October the 7th attack. This went on for months. There was months and months and months of people saying that even senior IDF commanders saying, one, that as far as they were aware, there was a mass Hannibal was in operation, and they were just shooting anything that moved to start with. Two, that they did in fact, shell dwellings where they thought there were terrorists, but also living in those dwellings were Israeli civilians that they thought had been taken hostage. Three, that the IDF acknowledged and admitted that, you know, many of the people that it thought were killed by Hamas, or initially said that they thought were killed by Hamas, were actually killed by the IDF. So this went on, these stories across the Israeli media and across and from official accounts went on for months. Now that none of those so all of those, if you attribute that to accidents, all of that must have been attributable to what they called friendly fire incidents. So you would have thought that there would have been significant given this mountain of evidence that attests to this, that they would have investigated these friendly fire incidents to some degree. But what we see is a downplaying of every single initial report that came out. It's consistently, they don't really investigate in the IDF's official account, which came out in, I'm going to say, October 2024, I think, or maybe it was earlier, March 2024, maybe. They attribute all of this to, yes, there was unfortunately some loss of life, but it was not much. It was, you know, we're talking dozens of people rather than hundreds of people. But they'd already admitted, the IDF, prior to that, which is not included in their subsequent investigations, that the number of casualties they lost to quote unquote friendly fire incidents was immense. So, you know, the subsequent, the narrative has shifted considerably over between the event itself and the contemporaneous reports that came out at the time and the subsequent narrative that was officially reported by the IDF. And one of the things that is really interesting, that really stood out, is that immediately following the attack, there are IDF units who are specially trained to analyze data and to analyze video footage and audio recordings to try and figure out, because the official narrative at the time was that this was all a catastrophic mistake. So there are IDF personnel whose initial job it was to look at that information to try and start figuring out what went wrong and why. That's their job. When they came to do that, these IDF personnel came to do that, as they told the Israeli media, they suddenly found that all the recordings and all the kind of official audio recordings and video recordings that they would rely upon to analyze, to find out these things, had been removed, downloaded, or was restricted. It was beyond their access. So normally they would have access to view this kind of thing, but on the morning after the attack, they suddenly didn't have access to review that. So given that these are the IDF personnel that are supposedly tasked with doing this kind of analysis, that suggests that at a senior command level, the IDF didn't want to do the analysis. Because if they wanted to do the analysis, they would have done it as quickly and as efficiently as possible. They didn't. They obviously withheld the data and the information from those that would normally be tasked with carrying out that work within the IDF. So that suggests to me that there is a difference between, you know, rank and file IDF soldiers probably, and IDF quite senior IDF commanders who are, you know, fulfilling their duty as troops, and senior commanders that don't appear to have been acting in their best interests.
You mentioned also before we started this interview that there have been testimonies by IDF soldiers testifying that they were basically told to stand down.
Yeah, recently, I mean, I've only just picked this up just prior to something that I saw the other day. But I mean, it appears that you know, there are testimonies coming out at the moment from IDF personnel saying that exactly that they were told to stand down that morning and not to do any patrols until 9 o'clock in the morning. Now, bearing in mind that the Ream military base, which must have been a key target, was supposedly taken at 7:30. Been taken at 7 6:30 in the morning. Now, if they were told not to patrol along the border until 9 a.m., then where they were coming from is difficult to know, because they probably would have been based at Ream or somewhere along the Gazan border, or somewhere along Route 232, up Route 232. But also, if they were not patrolling at that time, that of course would explain why at 7:39 and 7:56 in the morning, according to numerous sources, Hamas were moving freely up northwards from the Ream military base, because there wasn't any resistance. They must have been. I mean, and indeed, Hamas themselves have said that they were surprised by, well, they turned up to fight. They came armed to fight a heavy battle against armor as well, hence the Shahaz anti-tank missiles. But another point to point out is they weren't particularly well armed to blow buildings up. They didn't have that kind of capability. I mean, obviously, if you fire rockets and grenades, and they apparently had thermobaric grenades, which cause a lot of fire damage, but they weren't particularly well armed to blow buildings up. But they were well armed to shoot at tanks and things like that. But they didn't encounter any, because there was no resistance. Quite evidently, there was no resistance.
So in your article, you discuss various kinds of false flags. You let it happen on purpose, or make it happen on purpose. And this, of course, goes into the domain of speculation. But what is, as you see it, you don't think it's a joint venture between IDF and Hamas? More like they get this intelligence that it's coming, and they just sort of don't do anything. And then, as you say, they might have also sort of helped doing the killing. Or how do you see this dynamic?
Well, I think you're right. Exactly. We are now kind of venturing into the realms of speculation. So what I would say is that the evidence strongly indicates that elements within the Israeli hierarchy allowed the attack or facilitated the attack by ignoring all intelligence. And I'd also say that they'd had to ignore it for a long, long time. Hamas said that it had been planning this for 2 years. Now, Gaza is overflown by satellites, drones. Shin Bet and people like the Mitzvahvin units and things like that were operating deep inside Gazan territory. I mean, the people of Gaza complained of sleep deprivation because of the constant buzz of drones over their heads. The tunnel systems were continually attacked, so they were aware of the tunnel systems and what was happening with across the border and everything like that. So somehow Hamas managed to plan all this. This is the story that we are told. For 2 years, although again that's changed, now it's 7 years, but at the time it was 2 years. For 2 years they managed to amass all this equipment, all this armory. They managed to meet and discuss all of this while all of this surveillance is going on. Israeli intelligence didn't know anything about it. So the only conclusion that we can come from is that despite this incredibly overwhelming information gathering system that it's got, it's all completely useless. It's totally useless, because Hamas could act with impunity for 2 years. And then they attacked. And when they attacked, Israeli intelligence had to ignore warnings. It was aware of those warnings, and the fact that it says it wasn't aware of those warnings subsequently is a lie, because the night before the assault, the head of Israeli intelligence, the 3 branches of Israeli intelligence, and the military command met to discuss the mobilization of Hamas on the border. So this was the night before the attack. So they knew. They definitely knew. That's what they were discussing. Now, you would have thought that the response to that would have been to beef defenses, or to start sending defenses to the Southern Command. They did the opposite. They carried on moving defenses away from Southern Command. So, all in all, what this adds up to is, at a senior command level, and it can only have been at a senior command level, maneuvers were made in the course of, I would say, at least 2 years leading up to the assault, to ensure that it happened as it happened. And the big kind of, so that's what we might call, in terms of different types of false flags, a let it happen on purpose false flag, or lie hop false flag. Now, the degree to which Hamas was aware of that, then you really start getting into, like, kind of, there isn't, to be fair, there isn't a lot of evidence to substantiate or not the degree to which Hamas might have been aware of that. I mean, I can express an opinion, personally, given Hamas's history and given the way that things unfolded that day. I find it, again, hard to believe that, at least at the senior command level, that Hamas wouldn't have been aware of that. But that is pure speculation.
Yes. So you end your investigation by saying that, unfortunately, very few are willing to ask the real questions about October 7th. And frankly, this aspect, that it could have been a false flag, has been really completely absent from the discussion afterwards, mostly. So now, almost 2 years later, as you said, Gaza has been completely destroyed, and we might see even an Israeli annexation of Gaza. So what do you think could have been maybe different if this possibility of a false flag would have been a part of the debate from the very start?
Well, I mean, I think if it had been part of the debate from the start, the whole Israeli narrative for claiming justification for its subsequent actions is gone. It's gone. If elements within the Israeli administration, and I strongly suspect within the Israeli intelligence community, and I would also say probably other Western intelligence agencies as well, allowed this, or facilitated this, or enabled it to happen, then the whole subsequent claim, whether you consider it to be a legitimate justification or not, is not the point. It is the fact that the narrative has been used as justification. And I don't think anyone can deny that that is the case. It has been used as claimed justification for what has subsequently happened. If from the start, and I was one of the people that was speaking about this from the start, if that had been taken into consideration, then that notion that the subsequent actions are in any way justified is removed. It's gone. And it would be a lot harder for those who support Israel's subsequent actions to justify that support, and it would have been a lot harder for Israel on the international stage to garner the support that it has garnered from European and US administrations. So that wouldn't have happened had we confronted from the outset all the evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming in my view, all the evidence which suggests this was an Israeli let it happen on purpose false flag. So that's why this couldn't be more important. But this is, and I have to stress this as well, this is always how these operations work, because they have absolute total blanket coverage of the official account by the entire mainstream, or what I might call the legacy media. The official account that this was a wanton and unprovoked, quote, unprovoked terrorist attack is never questioned. That is never questioned.
So finally, before we wrap up, in one of your articles, you also discuss the arbitrary use of the word terrorism. What is your point here?
Okay, so in my view, I mean, for a start, in international law, there is no specific definition of terrorism. There is none. The UN's reporter, I can't remember this guy's name either. He spoke about the fact that at its basic level, all terror really means is the causing of extreme terror. That's all terrorism really means. And there are various different definitions applied by different countries in different circumstances, depending upon the political sensibilities that are prevailing there at the time. So there is no firm definition of terrorism. But if we accept what the UN rapporteur said, that the primary cause, that the main reason for a terrorist act is to cause extreme amounts of fear among the population with the objective of swaying the opinion or swaying the actions of that population and or their government. That is the point of terrorism. So it's to sway people to act through fear. So you could say, and I would not argue with this, that to the extent that Hamas attacks civilians on that day, that is an example of terrorism. Fine, I can accept that, and I agree. Similarly, the whole point of carpet bombing Gaza and burning children alive in their beds, which is what the Israelis have done, is the same. Hamas is the official government of Gaza. So the objective of what Israel is doing is to cause immense fear so that the population will sway the actions of their government, namely in this case Hamas. In theory, that's in theory what. So that too I would describe as terrorism. There's no distinction between the two. It's the same thing. So my argument about the label terrorism, which is subjectively applied to some group and not others, is that it loses all meaning unless we apply it consistently to everybody, including governments that are guilty of subjecting populations to extreme terror. We either apply it to everyone because the word terrorist means something, or we only apply it selectively under certain political, based on our political point of view, in which case terrorism has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. It's a meaningless label. So, personally, I would argue not that we get rid of the label terrorism, but that we significantly expand its use. It should be applied to terrorist governments, as well as groups who kill people indiscriminately for their own political agendas.
Iain Davis, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you very much, Pa.